Let's talk about another exciting end to the Italian season now. In Nicky Bandini's own words, it's very hard, and I'm quoting this verbatim, Nicky, it is really hard to read the tea leaves right now. It was to the very end of the Serie A season. Napoli, of course, managed to get over the line. I wonder where that now leaves Antonio Conte, because he's become the first manager in Italian football to have won the Scudetto with 3 different clubs. That is impressive, but can his current club keep him or not, is the question I would have thought.
Yeah, just revealing to the nation how much I think about tea. I think it's a really fascinating situation, honestly, that's unfolding at Napoli. At the end of the season, they've won the Scudetto, and you see Antonio Conte, who's suspended for that last game. He comes down onto the pitch, makes a beeline for Romelu Lukaku. First thing he wants to do is go give Lukaku a big hug, which I think speaks to their relationship. But De Laurentiis is just kind of hanging out by the side. That's the team owner, Aurelio De Laurentiis, hanging out by the side, waiting for his turn. And it was definitely when that finally happened, their little embrace, it was one of those moments where you think there's no warmth here, there's no enthusiasm of the manager for his boss. And a lot of people took that and took the words Conte said, which were very open-ended, and thought, okay, he's probably on his way. And there's been strong links to Juventus and some pretty obvious connections there. Giorgio Chiellini, who is now working, I think his official title is the head of institutional relations, which actually is a very funny way of describing a relationship with Antonio Conte, isn't it? He is absolutely an institutional relationship that club has. But certainly they've been on the phone and they've spoken, and Juventus want Conte back. They think he's the guy who can bring back the glory days. And it just looked on paper like this is definitely going to happen. Juventus want him. It makes sense for Conte, who hasn't really ever got on perfectly with De Laurentiis. And what a way to ride off into the sunset. You've won the title at Napoli. But in the days since, the picture has started to look a little bit fuzzier than that. Conte did have a big meeting with De Laurentiis and the Napoli board. Like 3 hours they were chatting together. There hasn't been any clear announcement that he's leaving. De Laurentiis has talked about wanting to give him time to think about the things they've talked about. And Napoli are kind of making a statement that they're there to be ambitious as well, because they've already been heavily linked with Kevin De Bruyne, which is a deal which may or may not rest on whether Conte stays, interestingly enough. They've made it clear that they're going to go after other big transfer targets. And maybe, just maybe, having got to the end of the season feeling various frustrations and like this would be a great way to ride off into the sunset, Conte is looking around and going, is it definitely a better bet to go back to Turin, or is it a better bet to stay here with this group that I've been working on for a year, where actually they're willing to throw some money my way?
I think that's it really, isn't it? De Laurentiis is showing already, whatever happens, whether Conte goes or stays, he's showing that he has learned a lot from what happened the last time Napoli won the Scudetto, where they made a mess of the Luciano Spalletti situation / contract extension that didn't end up getting him to stay. They made a mess of the succession, and it ended up in last season's 4-manager 10th place finish. And this time, I think you look at the fact they got Antonio Conte nice and early in the summer, but they've been prepared for him to leave all along. And I think that's the important thing. I think Napoli are in good shape whether he goes or whether he stays. But of course, the fact that they are in good shape, the fact they do feel organised, is something that's more likely to convince Conte to stay. I mean, we'll look at where Juventus are in a second, because I think that's a really important part of the equation as well. But clearly, De Laurentiis is absolutely determined that he will not be exposed like he was when Spalletti left last time, where they just stumbled into appointing Rudy Garcia, who turned out to be a terrible appointment. And he admitted that himself whilst Garcia was still in position, which was obviously dreadful. But I think this time, I think you look at not just the potential succession plan, but as Nicky was saying, the potential signings as well. And so much of the perception we have of it, because as Nicky always says, we can't be privy to the private thoughts of the protagonists, which change all the time. And I think often journalists are torn out for writing stuff well sourced in good faith. And of course, we're hostage, as anyone else is, to people simply changing their minds and situations changing. That's a normal part of life, and I think we have to appreciate that.
I think by the time people listen to this podcast, things may even have changed. That's just the reality. We're talking right now, but who knows?
Exactly. It's all changing so quickly. But I think the way that if we're looking at the body language of it and the very, very cordial, shall we say, greeting between De Laurentiis and Conte at the end of that game against Cagliari on Friday night, where everything else is popping off, where Scott McTominay's having the time of his life, etc., etc. I think the thing that came across to me about De Laurentiis, the way he strode onto the pitch at the Stadio Diego Armando Maradona with confidence, as if to say, not only have we won it again for the second time in 3 years, but this time I've got it. And so if you're talking about that, like before we even get to Conte staying, if you get to a point where you're pretty close on getting De Bruyne, where you're pretty close, it seems, on getting Jonathan David from Lille as well, if you're De Laurentiis, not only can you say, I'm going to make your squad better, but you're going to be saying, oh, in January when you were chewing my ear off to get Alejandro Garnacho, turns out I'm right. Turns out I do know what I'm doing, and turns out you will have a team and a squad for the Champions League next season.
I think that leads into something which is just out of everyone in this Napoli story, big winner by a million miles, Aurelio De Laurentiis. De Laurentiis, who has this situation at the club, which everyone has had at Napoli forever, which is this club will never win without Diego Maradona. They've won it 2 times in 3 years. They've done it with different managers. They've done it despite the sporting director, Cristiano Giuntoli, who everyone gave a huge amount of credit for the first win, going to Juventus, while De Laurentiis was saying he's not as important as you think he is. Well, look what's happened. They've won without him, and I do think that's put a certain twist on the dynamic here. In that, I think even if Conte leaves, De Laurentiis can turn around and go, okay, we'll do something else. But I do wonder a tiny bit. And you hinged at it there, Andy, how much De Laurentiis is pulling on that particular thread at the moment of, we're over here winning. Juventus, who, by the way, I think are close to appointing Damien Comoli as another director. There's going to be a lot of cooks in that kitchen in terms of who's supposed to be leading on the strategic vision, I think, between Giuntoli and Comoli and perhaps someone with rising influence like Chiellini as well. I do think he can put forward quite a compelling proposition of, actually, we're the stable ones, we're the ones who know what we're trying to do.
Yeah, it does sound, and what an Italian drama we've got in front of us. This is a proper Shakespearean feast, but it does sound, from what you both say, as if De Laurentiis has got the upper hand. And of course, if you're Antonio Conte, there's one caveat you have to bring in, which is, look, I'm lukewarm to this bloke. We know that Antonio Conte, despite finding it difficult to read his mind, we know that for him, his relationship with owners seems to be very important. He's lukewarm with this bloke, even though Juventus, his perhaps preferred destination, might not be in the shape that you've said that it should be in. However, to stay at Napoli, what does he do about that relationship with De Laurentiis? How does that improve or not?
I think it doesn't really matter that much. I think they've both gone in with their eyes open, and they know what each other are like. They know that they've got completely different ways of viewing how you should run a football club. But for them to start this partnership in the first place, everyone made a big fuss when, going back to February, March, particularly after things had settled, after he didn't get the transfer window he wanted in January. People saying, oh, they're clashing. And it's like, yeah, that's not the story. The story is, why has it taken this long? That's the story. And the fact is, they don't have to go on holiday together or whatever, do they? They just have to understand that they can get what they want out of each other. I feel that De Laurentiis and Conte, even in this relatively short sample size, it's just a really transactional relationship, and that's fine. I don't think that's a problem. And I think for Conte, who's very forthright to know where he stands, is important. I guess the question, Nicky, is if he goes to Juventus, he just about scraped into the Champions League on the final day with that win in Venezia, and what was such an exciting game. As you say, with everything changing upstairs, with Comoli coming in, with Chiellini's role possibly changing, with Giuntoli under a bit of pressure because he went all in on Thiago Motta and Motta didn't last the season, with doubts over what's going to happen next with Igor Tudor because he suggested after the Venezia game that he wouldn't continue and take the club to the Club World Cup if he wasn't going to be given next season. Now, look, his agent has backed off that on his behalf and recanted a little. But do you really know what you're going into? Like, I don't know. If you're at Napoli, if you're Antonio Conte, you go into the shed and you know where all the tools are. Mm. And you go into Juventus and, okay, you can say he knows the club. He doesn't know the club now, does he? Because what shape the club is institutionally as much as anything else, he can't really know, can he?
Yeah, I think that's definitely, again, we're back to where we started on. You can't know what's going on inside someone's head, but it's a consideration you can certainly imagine he'd want to make. Napoli, you can see the drawbacks to staying with Napoli pretty clearly. He's won the league now. How is he going to take them forward, especially given that we all know that a big part of this story is they played 17 fewer games than Inter this season. Next season they're going to be in the Champions League and you're not going to be able to ignore that in the way that he did the Coppa Italia, where they went out by fielding a reserve team against Lazio in the last 16. Like he's going to have to take that seriously. So at Napoli, there's going to be challenges, even just sustaining what you achieved. And yet, arguably, you still have, I would say, more manageable expectations. This is always Conte's thing. Conte is always, at every club he's ever been at, this constant bundle of tension about unfair expectations being placed upon me, right? It's what he said all season at Napoli is it's completely unrealistic to expect us to win the league. It's not fair. You shouldn't be expecting this when we are not doing what other clubs are doing. Before he left Juventus, it was exactly the same thing just about the Champions League. You can't go to a €100 restaurant with €10 in your pocket. That was his line, which, of course, then Max Allegri showed up and went straight to the final, which made him look a bit silly. But he's going to do that wherever he is. But I do think at Juventus, it's going to be for whoever goes there next, and it could well still be Conte. I want to stress that if you're listening to this right now. As far as I'm concerned, it's almost just as possible that this goes either way, that he stays or goes. But if he does go back to Juventus, there's going to be an expectation, unfortunately for him, that is significantly centred on just the fact that he's Antonio Conte, that they will compete for the league title again. And have they got the resources to do that? Open question, I'd say. They are a very young team that had a lot going for them in that regard this season. They've got some young players that you're excited about building the team around, like Yildiz. But Conte also likes to do things his way. And are they going to want to spend the money that they spent last summer to support Motta's way? Are they going to want to spend that all over again and do it for him? What is the guarantee that he gets everything he wants there? I'm not sure it's as black and white as it might first appear. That black and white, of course, Juventus didn't do it on purpose, but there you go.
I missed that one. Sorry, I was on their
I
away kit.
I said it.
I was on their away kit, so I was like, well, it's a black and white thing. But you know, Andy you pointed out, Andy, a moment or two ago that there was a lot more jeopardy at the end of this season. This Serie A season than just who lifts the Scudetto, who gets into the Champions League. You've got to feel sorry for Roma, though. I mean, edged out by Juventus by 1 point after the end of the season that they have had, and you know Claudio Ranieri gets all the plaudits, etc. But you got to feel sorry for him, and I can't help wondering what happens to Roma now. Where do they fit into next season?
I think you're right to point out, Dotton, this really affects, I think, how you view the Juventus job, actually. Because if we're talking about having things ready for next season, having a sense of certainty to next season, that's perhaps Ranieri's greatest gift to Roma. okay, they didn't make the Champions League, but apart from that defeat, like 3 games before the end of the season to Atalanta, a game that they could have easily won, which would have made the second half of the season absolutely faultless. Even getting them into 5th, Ranieri has performed way, way above expectation. So it would have been nice to make the Champions League. It would have been helpful, I guess, to a degree. But it was never essential because halfway through the season, they didn't look like making any type of European competition at all. What he's done is got that club on an even keel, got them looking towards the future. He's, I think, made order of the squad as well. So I think it's easier to go into the transfer window like that too. I mean, it looks like it's going to be Gianpiero Gasperini leaving Atalanta and going to Roma. And, you know, I think Gasperini, maybe he feels he's done all he can at Atalanta, and I understand that. Roma are a big club with huge potential who've won relatively few trophies, given what size of club they are. But if you're Gasperini and you feel like you had your 4 games at Inter, but you feel like you really deserve your crack at a top club, I think that's very appealing. You know, medium term, they're looking into going into a new stadium, of course, which will change their financial dimension. But in the short term, they fill the Olimpico most weeks. There's an incredible feel-good factor since Ranieri's absolutely transformed the club really on and off the pitch. You're getting the endorsement of Ranieri because he's had a huge hand in picking his successor as well. And I do think that plays into where Juventus are, because they've got to really recalibrate, and whether it's realistic for them to be title challengers next season is one question. The way Roma have finished this season, if Roma get a full season like the second half of this season and a new coach who we know is enormously capable, who's to say Roma aren't going to finish above Juventus next season? You could argue the competition for Juventus next season is even more than it was this season.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think it's going to be a really, really, well, it's going to be a really fascinating summer first. We don't know for certain that the Gasperini deal is happening, but it looks very likely at the moment. And then that opens up the Atalanta job. We still don't know for certain if the Inter job might come available. We have a lot of jobs that might come available this summer. The only one that we've really got nailed down at the top part of it is Vincenzo Italiano. Sounds like he's ready to sign his new contract at Bologna. So lots of fascinating questions. Milan as well, of course. There's a lot of dominoes that almost are set to fall off one another, and in some ways we're all kind of waiting to see if Conte is the first one, or if something else will happen first. Because, for instance, Max Allegri, who's been at Milan and Juventus before now, is reportedly very close to signing a new deal with Milan, but also Napoli have been making inquiries as a potential replacement if Conte goes. So will he sign that deal at Milan before waiting to find out? I think there's all of this intrigue about what's going to come next in Serie A. I think there's a lot when it comes to those top clubs. But I do think Roma under Gasperini is one of those projects I'd be really excited to see. I think it's brave by him in some degree, because actually he has kind of established that he can keep doing it year after year. At Atalanta, I think it's 9 seasons he's been there. Only 3 times he's missed out on the top 4, which is extraordinary. I would say that Roma would be very, very happy at this point to have a 9-year stretch in which they only missed the Champions League 3 times, because that has been a real struggle for that club and is very much the focus of that club at the moment, is getting back into that competition. So yeah, I think we've just had, personally, an extremely entertaining Serie A season in terms of the closeness of it. And I think next season, the title race, the Champions League race, all of those are going to be very, very tight again.